Good morning, everybody. If you remember, I told you about a teacher's institute that I got into at Jamestown. So I decided that this would be a perfect opportunity to make another video. So I am all packed. I'm getting ready to head to Jamestown, and I can't wait to show you what I've learned. This year's institute is all about the three cultures that converged at Jamestown, which are the Native Americans, or the Powhatan to be specific, the Englishmen, and of course the West Africans that were brought over against their will. First stop is Paspahegh Town, which is a recreation of a Native American village. These American Indians were here way before the English settled, way before the West Africans were brought over, so their way of life is pretty interesting. You'll notice that the crops that these people planted were not planted in rows, but more in clusters. They also used very tall, thin trees to hang birdhouses that were made of dried out gourds. The birds would keep unwanted insects out of their gardens. And there's also a sort of tree stand at the back where they could hunt larger critters that they could use for food. The houses of the Powhatan Indians were called Yehakans and were single-family residences. This is an example of a kitchen. We'll get into that a little bit later, but let's go ahead and go inside and see what we can find. So when we go in, we're going to notice a couple of things that the American Indians kept in their Yehakans. These are handmade nets that were used for fishing. Then we've got some baskets that were used to store food or other supplies. And you have a bed. And fun fact, beds were only available for adults. Kids slept on the floor. You also have arrows for hunting. And of course they had to have clothes. So they used this bone needle and thread that was made of the tendons of animals to sew leather together. Another thing that I learned while I was here is that Yehakans had fires going year-round. Yes, even in the hot summer. But the smoke that would go up through that opening at the top would actually keep the humidity down, which is something I didn't know. We have a lot of animal skin and those baskets that we've seen that were handmade. In this picture, you can see several artifacts that are used to tell the story of the Powhatan people in Jamestown. In the back of the table, you can see stone tools, a knife, corn, beads, but there are two things that I especially want you to pay attention to. That would be the square of copper with the blue beads and the raccoon skin. Englishmen, when they arrived at Jamestown, had never seen raccoons before, so they took the Algonquian word for this animal, which was raccoon. They also did this with opossum. Now, that necklace may not seem like much to you, but to the Powhatan people, it was a sign of status. Only the most important members of their society had these necklaces because that square is made of copper, and copper is very hard to find in Virginia. When the Englishmen came, they actually had copper buckets and copper to spare because they had plenty, and it wasn't worth much to them. So when they started trading with the Algonquian people, they were using their copper as a way to trade for food. But we'll get into trading a little bit later. Let's go check out other artifacts. Most of you can recognize this artifact as a canoe. Using tree trunks, the Native Americans would burn the side of the tree, put out the fire, then scrape out the softened wood, creating the hollow space of the canoe. If you know something about wood, when wood gets wet and then dries out, it can rot and fall apart. What I didn't know until this experience is that the Native Americans kept the canoes submerged underwater until they needed them again to prevent rotting. If it never dried out, it would never rot. This is what we would consider the kitchen. You can see a fire going that would be used like our oven or our stove, as well as several clay pots to the right of it. Under those pots, you would find ashes and coal from the fire that would keep the contents inside hot for a long while, kind of like your mom's crock pot. To the back, you can see fish that's being smoked. Sometimes you may have other meats being cooked. However, because they're on the James River, their main source of meat is fish. Lucky for me, I got to cook in this kitchen and try some new foods. The food we got to make is very similar to a tamale. First, we took dried corn and pulled it off the cob. This was way easier than I thought it was going to be. Then, we had to make cornmeal by crushing the corn using this mortar and pestle. Once the cornmeal was made, we mixed it with water and some berries, and it was time to prepare it. We scooped up some of the dough we made and wrapped it in corn husks, just like you would when making tamales. Once it was wrapped, they boiled in a pot for a few hours, and later on we were able to try them. I'm proud of myself for trying it, but definitely wasn't my favorite. In 1607, 3 ships arrived in what would be known as Jamestown. The Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery brought over Englishmen in search of economic opportunities. They had no intention of staying very long. We know the most about the English culture because of the documents they kept. For instance, we know that this deck would have housed 52 men, their dogs, and their chickens. Few beds, no air conditioning, and these windows were only opened if they needed the cannons. Below deck would have been packed with supplies for their survival once they found land, and the skylight, if you want to call it that, was the only source of light and fresh air, if it wasn't closed because of rain or bad weather. I learned a lot about navigation because they didn't have Google Maps telling them to turn right at the next wave. And of course, Miss Barlow had to get hands-on, and I was able to actually hoist some sails, which was so much fun. These Englishmen had to have a place to sleep, eat, and plan how they would make money for the Virginia Company, so they had to build some buildings. These buildings were made from lumber and a clay mixture that was made of red clay, water, straw, and sand. The biggest building in the James Fort was the governor's house. This house had many rooms to conduct business, sleeping quarters for advisors and security, as well as the master bedroom for the governor. Although it looks spacious and private, all beds, including the governor's, could sleep 4 to 5 men at a time. Talk about hogging the covers. The next largest building was the church. The Church of England was the only church of Jamestown, and colonists were expected to follow, for the king was the head of the government as well as the church. From 1610 to 1619, everyone was required to attend church twice a day. If you didn't show up, you could be punished by not getting food for the day or even death. Other buildings included storage for armor and weapons, as well as places for blacksmiths to work. Although it looks like a well-put-together town, the Englishmen had no idea how to survive in Virginia. They had to rely on the Native Americans for trade. Keep in mind, the English had things that the Powhatan wanted, but the Powhatan had supplies that the Englishmen needed to survive. The Englishmen offered colored textiles, glass beads, weapons, and copper, and the Powhatan offered food, animal skin, and information on where to find resources like gold. Before the Powhatan would trade with the English, gifts were exchanged as a way to show respect and cooperation. We gave a necklace with the copper pendant, and they gave their shoes. Trading was difficult as the Powhatan and Englishmen spoke very different languages. Listen and see if you can guess what he's asking for.
Nekut mamahak akakaal. Neras chespin miske, warawankwa.
Did you guess what it is? It is a sword. He wanted to trade his sword for the Englishman's sword. I would not have gotten that in a million years. At some point in our trading, we were perceived as being disrespectful. So here you see one of the leaders of this tribe dropping corn on the ground. This was kind of a slap in the face for the Englishmen who needed that corn to survive. So this was their way of reminding them that the English were reliant on the Native Americans. Archaeologists learned a lot about the Native Americans through artifacts and history passed down from generation to generation. Historians know a lot about the English because of their written records and communications with Great Britain. The group of people we know the least about is the West Africans who were brought here against their will in 1619. The status of the first Africans is debated, but their impact on culture of Jamestown and the economy of the British colony is undisputed. It's well known that Africans were originally forced into slavery to keep up with the ever-growing tobacco industry of Virginia in the 1600s. What is not as well known is how much of their culture they brought with them to Jamestown. Before West Africans were forced to Virginia, beans such as black-eyed peas, bell peppers, and bananas were not a part of the normal cuisine. The flavoring of the food they were accustomed to changed the way the English and Native Americans fixed their own foods. Some similarities are found between the three cultures in that the status and role of the person probably affected the way that they dressed. Colorful beads were specifically made for trade, and gourds were used frequently as bowls and storage containers. While the colorful beads were more for trading, the cowrie shells held a symbolic and spiritual meaning for African peoples. They were often used in offerings as spiritual protection, and these shells and copper-hammered currency were used to display and carry their wealth. I had an amazing time at Jamestown learning about all three cultures, and I officially need a nap. So I hope you all enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed my time there and putting this video together. I will see you guys soon. Oh, and treat people with kindness.